Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Popular Resistance has a piece entitled Frederick Douglass on the Meaning of July 4th to the Slave. I Must Mourn. On July 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass gave his classic speech at Rochester, New York on the meaning of the 4th of July to the American slave. These words, spoken in 1852, are relevant to modern U.S. society mired in the legacies of slavery and racist brutality. For insight into this, we turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne. And as always, Dr. Horne, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
I will read one short paragraph here from that speech. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all others of the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings with all your religious parade and solemnity are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes that would disgrace a nation of savages. And I thought that was the response to the Supreme Court's decision regarding admissions to colleges, Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, certainly your point is well taken, but I should also point out that the U.S. national holiday, July 4th, marking the Declaration of Independence from London, is increasingly being seen, as Frederick Douglass pointed out in 1852. That is to say that the slave owners led by George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry, they revolted against London, not least because in 1772, in Somerset's case, London had moved to abolish slavery in England itself, and there was a real fear that that decision would leapfrog the Atlantic. An adjunct to that point of view is that Britain, which was seeking to corral a far-flung empire, that at that point included not only the Caribbean, but also the jewel in the crown, speaking of what was called British India, they were relying more heavily upon black men in arms. And they were also dispatched to the 13 colonies in North America. And up until quite recently, the idea of Negroes with guns sent a free zone of apprehension down the spines of many of these settlers. And then there's the question of land. That is to say, London had grown tired of waging war against indigenous nations so that real estate speculators like George Washington, a true ideological and financial ancestor of real estate speculator Donald Trump, he was a main beneficiary of these wars against the indigenous. And when London expressed reluctance to continue that practice, Washington felt he had no alternative but to revolt. Now, this point of view is increasingly being accepted, which is one of the reasons why you've had a hysterical reaction to historians, not only by Donald J. Trump, who appointed the 1776 commission in the waning days of his administration to rebut these credible allegations, but also Governor DeSantis of Florida, his major competitor, who has teachers in Florida in a state of panic about teaching about slavery and teaching about the true history of the United States of America. I should also say that if you want to understand how we moved away from enslavement of black people, you have to understand in the first place external events. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which ignited a general crisis in the entire slave system that could only be resolved with this collapse. And then the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which let loose forces that led to the erosion of Jim Crow by the 1950s. Unfortunately, this kind of outlook is not necessarily the outlook of many in the Black leadership who are left to puzzle and wonder as to why affirmative action is under attack. And yet the Supreme Court carved out an exception for affirmative action for military academies. In other words, you can die defending the empire, but as Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson pointed out, don't expect to be invited into the boardroom. I should also say that ideologically, the NAACP, which is in the forefront of this trend I've just enunciated, they'll be meeting at the end of July in Boston. And of course, the lead speaker is none other than Hillary Rodham Clinton. But until the NAACP comes to recognize that as a result of the bargains that were brokered to erode Jim Crow in the 1950s, whereby the liberals, led by the NAACP, were forced to not have allies to their left, while the conservatives and reactionaries see no antagonists to their right. That is the essence and nub of the problem. And until they grasp that nettle, I'm afraid to say that we'll be going down slow.
You know, one of the things he says, the existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, your community as a lie. You know, it destroys your moral power abroad. He's bringing about the contradictions between the rhetoric of the United States and the actions, which takes us right to Orinoco Tribune, why Europe, U.S., China, and Russia are not the same for Latin America. And the world looks at America and it says, well, you say you're for independence and sovereignty, but you overthrow government after government. You say you have human rights, but look at the Palestinians, look at what's happening in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Libya, on and on and on. And that this, I think, article shows exactly what he was saying. These countries and these people are saying, well, we look at Russia and China and we look at their history and what they've done in our region. We look at what the U.S. empire has done in our region, and these things aren't the same. And so we have a different relationship with them. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
And it all begins, I'm afraid to say, with the indigenous nations. That is to say, the United States waged relentless war from the Atlantic to the Pacific against indigenous policies, routing them, committing genocide, and you cannot begin to understand U.S. foreign policy in the 20th and 21st century with wars of aggression too numerous to mention, but let's just mention in passing Vietnam, the Korean Peninsula, the attempt to involve NATO in a proxy war against Russia as we speak. All of those are an outgrowth of domestic policy, including the war on Mexico, which led to the ascension of Texas into the United States, not to mention the ascension of California, presently the most populous and most affluent state in the United States of America, by some measures, the fifth largest economy on planet Earth. And in terms of our friends in Latin America, they are slowly beginning to realize that there is a connection between oppression and persecution on these shores and the execution of U.S. foreign policy. And here, once again, many of our friends on the left who have swallowed the Kool-Aid with regard to accepting the mythology, the creation myth of the founding of the United States in 1776 as the great leap forward for humanity, many of them also, believe it or not, accept the idea that the Monroe Doctrine of 200 years ago was meant to keep Europe out of this hemisphere, as opposed to the Monroe Doctrine meant to allow the United States to treat this whole hemisphere as its backyard. And of course, the adjunct to the Monroe Doctrine was supposed to be the United States would not interfere in European affairs. But of course, a major supporter of the Greek revolt against Ottoman Turkey in the 1820s was no less than the United States of America. So Frederick Douglass's words, lamenting, abhorring, rebuking the hubris and hypocrisy of the United States of America, those words are just as credible and accurate as they were when they were announced in 1852.
And on the domestic front, he says, feeling themselves harshly and unjustly treated by the home government, your fathers, like men of honesty and men of spirit, earnestly sought redress. They petitioned and remonstrated. They did so in a decorous, respectful, and loyal manner. Their conduct was wholly unexceptionable. This, however, did not answer the purpose. They saw themselves treated with sovereign indifference, coldness, and scorn, yet they persevered. They were not men to look back. Oppression makes a wise man mad. That sounds an awful lot like 2023 in the United States, Dr. Horne.
And once again, I think that many of our scholars today have been overly credulous in accepting the creation myth of the United States of America. For example, we're told that the Constitution was ultimately an anti-slavery document, even though the number of enslaved Africans increased geometrically and exponentially post-U.S. Constitution. We are told that this is so, even though Washington, the federal government, had sole and exclusive jurisdiction over the 10-mile square area that constituted the national capital in Washington, D.C., and yet slavery flourished in Washington, D.C. before the U.S. Civil War. In fact, by some measures, Washington, D.C. was more of a slave market than New Orleans, even though Congress, and by the way, numerous congresspersons, not to mention presidents and vice presidents and Supreme Court justices, held enslaved Africans in bondage, even though supposedly they were administering this alleged purported anti-slavery republic. The hypocrisy is sickening.
Biden calls Cuba terrorist while the people demand an end to U.S. terrorism against Cuba. And that's in Orinoco Tribune. Interesting because the U.S. uses that term state sponsor of terrorism just for a punitive manner. Iran, Syria, whoever they don't like is a state sponsor of terrorism. Your thoughts?
Well, U.S. imperialism has a memory like an elephant. It is yet to forgive and forget the fact that the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, ignited a general crisis in the entire slave system, including in the United States of America, that could only be resolved with its collapse, leading to the loss of fortunes in the billions in the bodies of enslaved Africans, nor has U.S. imperialism forgiven or forgotten the Cuban Revolution, which led, of course, as we know, to Cuba, under the leadership of the late Fidel Castro Ruz, dispatching thousands of Cuban troops to Southwest and Southern Africa to liberate Angola in particular from Portuguese colonial rule, not to mention repelling an invasion from then apartheid South Africa, leading to the liberation of the entire subcontinent. Cuba has not been forgiven for that, which is one of the reasons why it's under tremendous sanctions, one of the reasons why the United States is still trying to strangle the Cuban Revolution. But I'm afraid to say that Uncle Sam is well past his sell-by date, that rather hypocritical and hubristic attempt to strangle the Cuban Revolution will prove unavailing.
And we have just a minute and a half left. Why Europe, U.S., China, and Russia are not the same for Latin America, Dr. Horne?
Well, that's obvious. Let's take Russia to begin with. We know that the father of the Russian language is Pushkin, a man of African descent. We know, even the New York Times acknowledged, that in the 1890s, when independent sovereign Ethiopia, the sole truly sovereign nation on the continent, was repelling an invasion from Italy, that it was pre-1917 Russia that armed Ethiopia to the teeth to prevent Ethiopia from being overthrown. Of course, that had a lot to do with the Christian commonalities between Addis Ababa and Moscow. And as already enunciated, the Soviet Union, post-1917, supplied enormous aid for liberation fighters in Africa, which is one of the reasons why Africa is so lukewarm, to put it mildly, towards sanctions against Russia, because they know that a strong Russia is important to international peace and security, and ultimately repelling the imperialist vampires and werewolves.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.